Altissimo, onnipotente, buon Signore, tue sono le laude, la gloria e l'onore, ed onne benedizione. A te solo, Altissimo, si confana, ed null'uomo è ne te lento vale. Laudato sia, mio Signore, con tutte le tue creature, specialmente messor lo frate sole, lo quale giorno ed al lume di noi per lui, ed ello è bello e radiante, con grande splendore. De te, Altissimo, porta significazione. Laudato si, mi Signore, perso la luna e le stelle. In cielo l'hai formate, clarite, ed preziose, ed belle.
All praise be yours, my Lord, through brother Son, who brings the day, and through whom you give us the light. All praise be yours, my Lord, through sister moon and stars. You have made them bright and fair in the heavens. In the heavens.
Laudato si, mi Signore, per frate vento, et per aere, et nubilo, et sereno, et onne tempo, per lo quale alle tue creature dai sostentamento. Laudato si, mi Signore, per soracqua, la quale è molto utile, ed umile, ed preziosa, ed casta. Laudato si, mi Signore, per frate fuoco, per lo quale n'allumini la notte, ed ello è bello ed iocundo, ed robustoso ed forte. Laudato si, mi Signore, per sora nostra madre terra, la quale ne sostenta ed governa, ed produce diversi frutti, con coloriti fiori ed erba. Laudato si, mi Signore, per quelli che perdonano per lo tuo amore, e sostengono infirmitate e tribulazioni. Beati quelli che sosterranno in pace, che da te, Altissimo, siranno incoronati.
All praise be yours, my Lord, through brother wind and through the air, cloudy and clear and all kinds of weather. All praise be yours, my Lord, through sister water, so pure, beautiful, humble, and very precious. Very precious.
Laudato si, mi Signore, per sora nostra morte corporale, dalla quale null'uomo vivente può scappare. Guai a quelli che morranno nella peccata mortale, beati quelli che troverà nelle tue santissime volontati, che alla morte seconda non farà male. Laudate e benedicetemi, Signore, et ringraziate et serviateli con grande umilitate.
All praise be yours, my Lord, through brother fire and through how dear sister mother earth, who sustains us. All praise be yours, my Lord, through sister bodily death, from birth no can escape. Can escape.
The Church's traditional ecology seems to me to be based on Genesis, where God gave dominion over the world to the human race.
God has entrusted the creation to us. It's not ours, it's God's. But nevertheless, we are the stewards of that creation.
The Church has a very long history of caring for the environment. It's not well known.
With the Industrial Revolution and so on, social problems became uppermost in the minds of church people, and the environment tended to get neglected, as it did in the rest of society.
What's new with Pope Francis is that he's brought the Church into the question of climate change. The Church is now taking a position on man-made climate change to say, yes, it's happening, and we need to act to prevent it.
There's no doubt that the climate is altering. The question is why and what the rational thing is to do about it. If you look back at the Gospels and the narrative of Christ's presence on earth, you recognize that the environment in which he lived was actually unspoiled. You know, there they were, fig trees and olive trees everywhere. You know, the cedars were still there in Lebanon. The waters of the Jordan were flowing in such a pure way that you could baptize people in it.
The Church was very concerned that human beings saw, for example, the Garden of Eden as the place where we were at one with creation, we were in harmony with creation. And the Desert Fathers, for example, wanted to, by their lives, reconstruct what it was like to be in Eden by their treatment of wild creatures. There were lots of lovely legends about how they and the wild creatures, the lions, for example, would befriend them and they would help them out, and everything would be just as it was in the Garden of Eden. They're very concerned to show that to be a true Christian was to be someone who lived as if the fall had never happened.
If you look at the whole Benedictine tradition, the whole day is structured in such a way that you think about creation and caring for creation and honoring God and thanking God and doing his work.
For a medieval lord, there were rights, but there were also responsibilities. In theory, at least, a lord should look after his subjects. And so any theory of domination of the world also at that time carried the implications that exploitation was paired with stewardship, if you like.
The time of St. Francis of Assisi, there was great concern for nature and creation and seeing everything as kin. We are brothers and sisters with all of creation because we have one Father God. We've lost sight of a lot of that. It's been marginalized. The environment has been seen as yet another resource that we can make use of.
The environmental movement, as we have inherited it grew up really during the 19th century as very much a religious movement. And people like Ruskin and Wordsworth, who wrote quite passionately against the effects of the Industrial Revolution on not only on the natural environment of our country, but also on the towns and the way people live. They were writing as environmentalists.
The particular form of the Industrial Revolution, for instance, it's based on carbon, it's based on coal, it polluted the atmosphere in a huge way over 200 years. A theology of dealing with that was an urgent priority, and you could see it emerging during the 20th century. And now it's really urgent. We are in a world where we are, as a species, responsible for destruction of our own environment. The Church now has to cope with that fact.
I think Christians, by showing that they care for the environment, are actually making a very important statement, not just about their vision for the world, but about what it is that drives their vision for the world. And it seems to me that there's a very important opportunity for witness here, that belief in God does make a difference. That actually gives you a fresh vision of the world, which is laden with transformative impact for the environment. It's not just the individual actions that matter, it's the vision of reality that drives it.
Secular people tend to think of the earth as a means to the end of human uses, whereas religious people tend to see the earth and the universe as, like everything, as an end in itself, since it was created and not just discovered. So a religious person would say, you know, you should think of it as you would a work of art. What does it mean? Not what is the use of it.
In our Eucharist, for example, we bring elements of creation to God, and we see those elements redeemed in the sacrifice of Jesus on the altar. People of no religion, they miss that dimension. They miss the ultimate motivation, which is that what they're doing in helping the environment is giving glory back to God, giving praise to God in their actions.
With some deep environmentalists, deep green environmentalists, human beings are the worm in the apple. But for a Catholic, for a Christian, the context is that human beings aren't the worm in the apple. We're beautiful as well, but we all have to learn how to live within the context of all God's creation.
I think it has been a rather self-centered approach on the part of the industrialized world. You know, how bad will it be for us now? We won't have any petrol if we use it all up. How bad will it be if the climate changes? But I have not thought about the creation as having itself an intrinsic value, or animals themselves have an intrinsic value that deserves respect.
We're talking here of God's creation, and this is a creation we're talking about. And animals are part of God's creation. And animals we have a particular involvement with because of our scientific knowledge now. We do affect the natural world in ways that wasn't the case a long time ago. We have the capacity as humans now to even destroy the natural world. And in many aspects we are doing. So we need to go back to our basic of creation, that we are responsible and we're given by God responsibility for looking after creation, and that includes animals.
Both John Paul II and of course Benedict have spoken about the environment, and both of them have reminded us that we must show solidarity not with other creatures but especially also with the poor, because what we do to the environment affects all of us, and it affects in particularly the poorer people, actually, what we do to the environment.
Here we have the church, saying, actually, this is a concern which is absolutely at the heart of who we are as Catholics. Francis is starting, above all, from the point of view of the poor. He always speaks from the point of view of the poor. And, of course, the people who have suffered most from climate change and carbon emissions have precisely been in the developing world. He has some very moving passages about rivers which used to teem with fish which are now dead as a result of industrial pollution. Whole populations, livelihoods depend often on the state of the planet. We all have a duty to care for it, and we're all in this together. And I think this is where the Holy See and the Pope can act and speak with a kind of authority at a global level which no other leader on this earth can.
Il rispetto del creato è un'esigenza della nostra fede. Il giardino in cui viviamo non ci è affidato perché lo sfruttiamo, ma perché lo coltiviamo e lo custodiamo con rispetto.
The Vatican is the world's first carbon-neutral state. And I think Francis, that happened under Pope Benedict, Francis wants that to be an example. He wants Catholics to be the people who are conspicuous, not just for eating fish on Fridays, but for recycling. And I think we're talking here not just about an advocacy and the Pope seeking to use his authority and the Church's authority to influence nations, but also to mobilize the Church worldwide.
Most people perhaps are seeing climate change as a scientific issue, they're seeing it as a policy issue. They haven't yet connected it to their personal beliefs about their world, their responsibility to their world, their responsibility to their church, to their God, and so forth. And that's a very powerful motivating force if you can get people to think in those terms.
How many parishes worry about their immediate environment? How many of them do environmental audits and check on whether the lighting is the most ecologically efficient, whether they need to have pilgrimages that use aeroplane transport, and make sure that even in our own little world of our homes, our families, our schools, our parishes, to see that we're doing our bit for the environment. And I think what Pope Francis does is he's putting the message back into our hands and saying it's not people in power who are the ones who are going to change the world. It's everybody out there. It's all the people. And let's empower the poor, and that means all of us.
For a pope to have the name Francis immediately to the normal layperson out there gives straight away a memory of St. Francis of Assisi. And that gives us a clear demonstration, oh yes, St. Francis, he was animal lover. So the church has got an animal lover called Francis, and they make a connection, even if only at that level.
So one of the most interesting ideas of Pope Francis's teaching on ecology is the idea of an integral ecology, that actually the grammar of creation needs to be respected, both in terms of the natural world, but also in terms of human relationships. So I think what he's doing here is in a very Francis way, bringing together, if you like, a progressive agenda and a conservative agenda, concern about, for example, same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption. He's bringing these two together and saying, if we care that there is a divine design, if we believe that actually not everything we do is licit because of the impact that it has on our planet, then we need to have that same awareness also in our understanding, for example, of male-female complementarity or the needs of children.
Nel nostro tempo il matrimonio e la famiglia sono in crisi. La crisi della famiglia ha dato origine a una crisi di ecologia umana, poiché gli ambienti sociali come gli ambienti naturali hanno bisogno di essere protetti, anche se l'umanità ha ora compreso la necessità di affrontare ciò che costituisce una minaccia per i nostri ambienti naturali, siamo lenti, ma siamo lenti nella nostra cultura, anche nella nostra cultura cattolica. Siamo lenti nel riconoscere che anche i nostri ambienti sociali sono a rischio. È quindi indispensabile promuovere una nuova ecologia umana e farla andare avanti. Fare quello che possiamo perché tutti abbiano da mangiare, ma anche ricordare ai potenti della terra che Dio li chiamerà a giudizio un giorno e si manifesterà se davvero hanno cercato di provvedere il cibo per Lui in ogni persona e se hanno operato perché l'ambiente non sia distrutto ma possa produrre questo cibo.
A lot of people have been nervous about this encyclical because they see in it, and they're not wrong, a critique of contemporary market capitalism. Yeah, they see it as a critique of a certain model of consumerism. And I think there are people who are invested in that model who believe that actually, we need more market capitalism and more consumerism, not less. And therefore they detect behind the Pope's critique a socialist agenda or an agenda which doesn't properly understand market economics. I think they're wrong. And I think with this ecology encyclical, he's offering a challenge to some people, particularly in the United States, who have, I think, probably for too long put too much faith in the workings of liberal capitalism, of market capitalism.
Each of us has a little sphere where he can make a mess or clean up after himself. You do try and make sure that the world around you is not adversely affected by you being there.
At least for those of us who are privileged at the top of the economic pyramid, we just vastly overconsume. And that doesn't have to be something where somebody has to have any scientific knowledge. You get a sense in your gut very quickly that, you know what, I own too many cars and I drive around too much and I just eat too much food. So I think if people just paid attention to what their consciences are telling them, they'd move in a different direction.
One area in which Christians can make a difference is this very strong sense that we can give things up. What is there we can do as an act of sacrifice that's also an act of witness and is also good for our environment?
For instance, you can do good by not using a motor car unless you absolutely have to. You can do good by supporting traditional methods of farming. You can do good by making sure that the animals which you eat are properly reared. You can do good in all these individual ways. They're often quite costly, either in time or money, but they're good things that you do.
Jesus started with 12 people in a Roman Empire, and he caused mighty changes throughout the world. And even in our own worlds, if we change our lives, each individual changes his or her own life, little by little, we will make a difference.
Pope Francis has just released his new encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si. Here are the top 10 messages of the new encyclical. First, the big contribution of Laudato Si is an overview of the environmental crisis from a religious point of view. Until now, the dialogue about the environment was framed mainly with political, scientific, and economic language. Now, the language of faith decisively enters the discussion. Second, the disproportionate effect of environmental change on the poor is strongly highlighted in almost every page of the document, and the Pope provides many examples of the effects of climate change, whose worst impacts, he says, are felt by those in developing countries. Third, Pope Francis takes aim at the technocratic mindset, where technology is seen as the key to human existence. He critiques an unthinking reliance on market forces, in which every technological advancement is embraced before thinking about how it will affect our world. Christian spirituality, by contrast, offers a growth marked by moderation and the capacity to be happy with little. Fourth, against those who argue that a papal encyclical on the environment has no real authority, Pope Francis explicitly states that Laudato Si is now added to the body of the Church's social teaching. It continues reflection on modern-day problems that began with Leo XIII encyclical Rerum Novarum on capital and labor in 1891. Fifth, discussions about ecology can be grounded in the Bible and church tradition. In Chapter 2, Pope Francis introduces the Gospel of Creation, in which he leads readers through the call to care for creation that extends as far back as the book of Genesis, when humankind was called to till and keep the earth. But sadly, we have done too much tilling and not enough keeping. Sixth, everything is connected. Laudato Si is a systematic approach to the problem. First, the Pope links all of us to creation. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. But our decisions have an inevitable effect on the environment. A blind pursuit of money that sets aside the interests of the marginalized and poor and the ruination of the planet are connected. Seventh, Pope Francis does not try to prove anything about climate change. Rather, his encyclical accepts the best scientific research available today and builds on it. So Laudato Si draws on both church teaching and contemporary scientific findings from all fields to help modern-day people reflect on important questions. Eighth, Pope Francis critiques those who ignore the problems of climate change, and especially its effect on the poor. Why are so many of the wealthy turning away from the poor? Not only because some view themselves as more worthy than others, but also because frequently decision makers are, for the most part, removed from the poor, with no real physical connection to their brothers and sisters. Selfishness also leads to the evaporation of the notion of the common good. Ninth, perhaps more than any encyclical, Pope Francis draws from the experiences of people from around the world, referring to the findings of bishops' conferences in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. The Pope calls into dialogue and debate all people about our common home. And finally, this encyclical is addressed to everyone on the planet and calls for a new way of looking at things. We face an urgent crisis when the earth has begun more and more to look like, in Pope Francis's vivid language, an immense pile of filth. Still, the document is hopeful, reminding us that because God is with us, all of us can strive to change course. We can move towards an ecological conversion in which we can listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. To use religious language, what the Pope is calling for is conversion.
I'm speaking to you from a cliffside high above the town of Assisi. We're here filming for our Pivotal Players series on Francis of Assisi. Just up the road from me, there are some caves where Francis and his earliest followers lived soon after their order was officially established. Well, it's appropriate I'm speaking to you from Assisi, the day that Laudato Si, the Pope's new encyclical letter, was published. Of course, that opening line taken from the Canticle of the Creatures by St. Francis himself, someone who was deeply in touch with the beauty and dignity of creation. You know, I'll say much more about the encyclical. I just got it. I've just been kind of reading through it. It's a pretty lengthy document. I want to just share one idea with you, but I think it's a really fundamental one. Something which the biblical authors, the church fathers, and the great medieval doctors had in common was a cosmological vision. Go back to the beginning of the book of Genesis. Human beings are situated within a cosmic framework. It's not all about them. They have a very important stewardship role, but salvation will be played out within a cosmic framework. Now, look in the prophets, look in Isaiah, Jeremiah, look in the Psalms, look in the Song of Songs. All through the Bible you find this cosmological sensibility. Do you see it also in Chrysostom, Jerome, Augustine, Irenaeus? Absolutely, especially Irenaeus. Now come up into the Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas, absolutely. Bonaventure, yes. Francis of Assisi, maybe par excellence. A sense of how our salvation is worked out within a much larger cosmological framework. I'll tell you exactly where the idea comes from. It comes from a keen sense of creation, the Creator God. Since we are all coming forth here and now from the same creative source, we are all ontological siblings, if I can put it that way. In Francis' language, brother, sun, and sister, moon. When you have a keen sense of the Creator, you have an equally keen sense of how everything in creation is connected, related, integrated. Now, this, it seems to me, is the point that Pope Francis, above all, is making. It's a recovery of this ancient biblical, patristic, and medieval idea in the face of an aggressively anthropocentric modernity that wants to turn nature simply into something for us to manipulate. Now, I know I maybe do a little bit of modernity bashing, but let me go back to René Descartes, the founder of modern philosophy, who famously said, the purpose of philosophy, and by extension science, is to master nature. Furthermore, Descartes' philosophy begins with this anthropocentric turn, the turn to human subjectivity. And there he's echoed by everybody, from Leibniz to Spinoza to Kant to Hegel. What that produced was technology and science, God bless them, but it also produced a certain attitude toward nature, that we are in a prime position and nature is there to be ordered, manipulated, mastered. See, and that's repugnant to a biblical sensibility. It seems to me, everybody, that's the central idea that Pope Francis is recovering in this encyclical, and it's a very important one for all biblically formed people. Now, I'll have a chance, I hope, to read the thing much more carefully, and I'll give you some more reflections on it, but I think that's the main point that I'm taking away as I just glance at the encyclical. God bless you all.
Laudato Si, praise be to you. The central theme of St. Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Creatures is now a part of the tradition in a new and profound way. Inspired by St. Francis's proximity to poverty and creation, Francis, Bishop of Rome, has issued a landmark encyclical on ecology and care for our common home in the 21st century. It has been the most highly anticipated teaching document of a pope in recent memory, a penetrating reflection on the state of humanity's relationship with the natural world, and an urgent call to action in its defense. Today we're going to break it down for you and discuss some of the implications for our own lives, for our church, and for the whole human family. Joining me is Father Thomas Rosica, no stranger to our viewers. He's with us in his capacity as the English language assistant to the director of the Holy See Press Office. Marty Tyndall is the immediate past moderator of the United Church of Canada, and Alicia Ambrosio is a journalist and host of Salt and Light's Vatican Connections. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before we get deep into the discussion and the actual themes of this document, there's a small elephant in the room that we need to deal with, and that is what happened earlier this week with a leak of the official text before it was officially released. Father Tom, you work for the Holy See Press Office. What happened earlier this week?
Following a long-standing tradition of the Holy See Press Office and of Things Vatican, what would life be without a little leak? And there was a leak. It was not a little leak. It was a major leak that took place because a journalist, one who claimed to be a good Vaticanista, broke the embargo, and he said at the order of his editor of the Espresso newspaper, he should make the encyclical known, the Italian version, and it spread in a small circle of Italian journalists, Italian papers. But I have to say this, what it revealed more was some of the yet to be reconciled or healed dysfunction that takes place in that core of Vaticanistas, Italian ones particularly, and I say this as an Italian. It's embarrassing, it's shocking, but I also have to say that I regret that Sandro Magister, who was responsible for the leak, and his editor must have been very disappointed yesterday when the encyclical was released, because the leak actually helped the cause. It was no longer a leak. Yesterday was a torrent of goodwill towards this encyclical.
And even though we have to mention it already, it's sort of very far behind us, because now that the text is actually here, people are diving into it and trying to grapple with what the Pope is trying to say. Lisa, I want to get your reaction to the release of it. I mean, you're in touch with a lot of the journalists who are covering the Vatican, with people in that world. What was the response, immediate response, to what Pope Francis said in Laudato Si?
It was on the whole very positive. Like you said, the leak was very far behind. It had no effect. If anything, it just raised expectations. The press conference went on for over 2 hours. That's unprecedented. The questions were deep and thoughtful and serious questions, not fluffy kind of let's find holes in this logic kind of questions. And the coverage was amazing. The Guardian newspaper out of London printed excerpts, entire chunks of the encyclical, much to the disbelief of Catholics in the UK. Secular media was all over this, and in a very positive way. The one thing that we didn't get across very well was that the church has actually this has been the stand of the church for a very long time, but we've forgotten this. So to secular media, it seemed like groundbreaking, watershed moment, total revolution, whereas we were just getting back to our roots.
Mm-hmm. Marty, when you look at the context of this, you look at the release of this encyclical, and then you look at the world, you look at the state of the environment today around the world, but also the state of the Catholic Church, the state of the United Church, the state of Christianity. What is all coming together that makes this such a profound moment for the release of a document like this?
I loved what the Orthodox Metropolitan said in the news conference yesterday at the Vatican, that he and his church received this with joy and satisfaction. This encyclical is very resonant with what Canadian faith leaders, for instance, have also been saying. Most recently, a big interfaith statement calling for climate action in 2011, which I was a part of. So we are finding great encouragement in this statement, and it is an extraordinary statement in the way in which it is both deeply spiritual, deeply soulful and heartfelt, and broadly calling for action and public engagement. And to a United Church person's ears, that is music. The strong, hard description of what we are really up against, the realities. I think there is a longing, Sebastian, for leadership today. There's a longing for leadership that tells it like it is, that tells the truth about the challenges facing us in this world. And Pope Francis is doing that loudly and clearly on behalf of all of us, and he's inviting us into the dialogue, all of us. As a Protestant here, I'm grateful that it's an invitation to all of us.
Absolutely, and that the ecumenical dimension that you just touched on came across so powerfully in the presence of a representative of the Orthodox Church at the press conference yesterday. Let's just show our viewers a clip of that press conference.
The danger facing our common home, the planet in which we live, is described in the encyclical in a way leaving no doubt about the existential risk we are confronted with. This risk is common to all of us, regardless of our ecclesiastical or confessional identities. Equally common must be our effort to prevent the catastrophic consequences of the present situation. Pope Francis' encyclical is a call to unity, unity in prayer, in the same gospel of creation, in the conversion of our hearts and our lifestyles to respect and love everyone and everything given to us by God. We are indeed very grateful for that, and we respond with a wholehearted Amen.
Marty, when you see a non-Catholic releasing an official document of the Catholic Church, of the Holy Father, in that kind of way and speaking about it in that fraternal way, you think what?
Well, I'm not surprised. We're deeply encouraged throughout the church communities and, frankly, in Canada, throughout the faith communities. Because I think in Canada we have a particular way of recognizing and honoring one another from different faith perspectives and working together on common cause. So we're deeply encouraged. I'm not surprised. I think it resonates, as I said before, with what many of us have been saying over the years, but again, want to give credit to the Pope for the way in which he's said this. As a United Church person, I can tell you that in our Song of Faith, we speak about how God the Creator is revealed in every aspect, animate and inanimate aspect of creation. So for us, we will be adding volume to the Pope's words with deep gratitude.
The encyclical starts off in an interesting way because you have Pope Francis referencing his namesake, Francis of Assisi, and sort of putting this whole document and this whole way of looking at creation, putting on the lenses of St. Francis of Assisi. Father Tom, what's the significance of that? What does the Pope see in Francis of Assisi that's so needed today for us?
What the encyclical has done, and what Francis has done by choosing Francis of Assisi as his patron, is to rescue Francis of Assisi from some kind of a hippie status, some kind of a wandering creature in the fields, half naked or taming animals or whatever. Francis of Assisi was a great mystic and a theologian in his own right. And Francis of Assisi, long before courses in eco-spirituality, before encyclicals, Francis of Assisi was showing us that this earth upon which we live is Mother Earth, the beautiful way that he refers to it, and the exegesis, if you will, in the encyclical about the beautiful hymn, Laudato Si, praise be to you, and brother sun, sister moon, all of those images. Francis of Assisi has been doing that since the Middle Ages. It took us a while to come to that. What we saw happen yesterday, what we see happening every day in the Pontificate of Francis of Buenos Aires, is exactly that. It's an effort to reach out and make peace. It's an effort to bless God for the earth that's given to us and to care for it. And it's also an effort to put the poor in first place.
We're going to dive into the document itself right after this short break. But first, take a look at our new series, Creation. It's airing on Salt and Light Television now.
You feel a sense of awe and wonder, and that awakens something in you that you want to take care of this created world.
God has provided for us such incredibly beautiful things, and it would not be in our best interest as stewards of God's creation to be destroying it.
To know something is to love something. When you love something, you want to know more about it.
Welcome back. We're looking at Pope Francis's new encyclical on ecology. The first part of our program, we were talking about the context, the situation that this document has been released into. Now we're going to look at the document itself, some of the things that the Pope brings up. So let's look at the first 3 chapters here, beginning with, in my opinion, what is a keen awareness of the very real problems that the world and the environment face, according to Pope Francis. Alicia, when you looked at that analysis of the current situation, what jumped out at you? What are you hearing from Pope Francis?
Well, first of all, he's getting into the science, and he's making reference to studies. He's making reference to the lived experiences of other countries through their Episcopal conferences. We see him quoting the Canadians, the Japanese, the Filipinos. But what struck me as he was talking about some of the different effects that humans have had on the planet, I couldn't help thinking of actually being in Argentina many years ago and seeing rivers running filthy. And my mother explaining to me, well, it's filthy because they didn't realize that when they cut down that whole field over there, all the dirt was coming in. Or hearing relatives talking about floods. Last year there was a huge flood in in a neighborhood in Buenos Aires, and again, hearing my relatives tell me, well, that's because nobody realized that they couldn't dump their garbage on the street. And what I saw in his analysis was his own experience of having seen those same things, and going beyond that, having actually gone to the science to back up the reality that he's lived. So none of his analysis is hypothetical, abstract theory that he's read in a book. It's lived experience that he has gone and sought out the scientific backup for.
We hear things in that chapter like pollution, the problem of pollution, climate change, which was an issue that people were waiting to see if the Pope would talk about it. He said categorically that we are contributing, human beings are contributing to climate change, and the science backs that up. He also talked about the problem of water, biodiversity, problems in the Amazon. You know, raising all these issues, Marty, you say, okay, who's responsible or who has a hand, who's playing a hand in all of this? And if what Alicia says is true, you know, coming from his Latin American experience of the global South, and seeing the problems there especially, it raises this issue of the environmental problems affect the poorest people first and foremost. Now, we don't live in a very poor country, we live in one of the most affluent countries. What does this kind of analysis of the problems of the environment mean for a country like Canada, mean for us here in the Northern Hemisphere?
I so appreciate his language that we cannot hear the cry of the earth without hearing the cry of the poor. They're connected. My own church said almost 40 years ago, we cannot take care of or love one another. We cannot love one another without loving the garden. We cannot love the garden without loving one another. In Canada, I think there are a couple of very direct challenges to us. The Pope, for instance, speaks about Indigenous cultures, Indigenous peoples, needing to be principal partners in dialogue. Well, we're hearing this on the heels of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and having just heard very strong recommendations from that commission to us as a nation, as a land, about how we are to become two again, to walk side by side, and to respect Aboriginal voices, especially when it comes to large-scale projects that are planned for their land, which the Pope, and that's the Pope's language. He speaks directly to us there. The other area I think he speaks directly to is mining. When 3/4 of the world's mining companies are registered in Canada, and those companies are not obliged to follow the rules of human rights, of the law in other countries, protecting the environment, water sources. Yeah. They are not obliged to follow those laws in other countries in ways that they are obliged to follow those laws here in Canada. My church and others of us have been very involved in trying to get that legislation changed here in Canada, but it's a direct challenge to us to see that we act justly in relation to the world's poor.
A major theme, obviously, giving voice to people who are voiceless, and that's something, Father Tom, that is not just reflected in this document of Pope Francis, but his entire pontificate.
His entire life, his entire ministry as bishop. Unless we recognize the poor and put them in first place, our efforts they're failure from the beginning. You know, you talked about the structure of those first 3 chapters, and I think it's very important to watch the methodology that he uses. The first chapter lays out the problem before us. The world is in a mess. Our common home is suffering. We've made a mess of this. And he goes through and enumerates a number of the very serious issues that come to mind when we speak about the ecological crisis. Now, one could say he could have elaborated further, and the whole document could have been about the mess that we're in, and lists and tables. We saw a little bit of that yesterday with the German professor's presentation. But the second chapter is kind of the wake-up call to say, wait a minute, there is a mess, but let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the beautiful, as they call it, the gospel of creation. And there's a wonderful, from a biblical perspective, there's a wonderful exegesis that's done about that.
Yeah, excellent point. I think interesting that whole chapter on the gospel of creation, he really lays out a theology for care for the environment,
it's
for ecology.
It's a systematic, you know, people ask all the time, what's systematic theology? This is one of the most beautiful examples I've seen of a systematic theology, leading us right into the situation, the mess, the chaos, and then telling us there's a way out. And this is what we can do to heal the planet and also to put human beings back in first place in this planet.
Right, it's very...
And hope always follows lament and repentance.
That's right. Yeah.
We can't get there without facing
Otherwise,
into
it's not
it.
Christian. Yeah.
Yeah, and to have that now foundation, that biblical foundation, which is also a unifying quality, because the biblical tradition is not only the Catholic tradition, but for all Christian traditions as well.
And I think that's why so many people yesterday, when the document was released, so many people said this document not only makes it safe for Catholics and Christians to, quote, be green, but it now makes it mandatory. And we know for many decades there have been Christians of all confessions working around climate change and environmental issues, and kind of doing so with a little bit of fear of being labeled as being out there, having gone off track, of having gotten into New Age things and whatnot. And this document really gives that affirmation that no, you are not wrong. You are doing exactly what you're supposed to do.
I think particularly, though, about women religious in your church. They are among the most courageous people I know, and I get to work with some of them through the United Church Roman Catholic Dialogue here in Canada, and they are working at this on the ground, doing organic agriculture, inviting communities in, and now they have all this new encouragement.
Something happening too with I believe this encyclical. What the Pope has done with ecology and with the environment is very similar to what's just happened with liberation theology. It went through a period that needed purification. It needed a theology. It needed the right language. It needed to be tested and purified. And I believe the very same thing has happened here, because yesterday what was presented to the world is now official Catholic teaching. And in paragraph 15 of the encyclical, it kind of jumped out at me. It says, Catholic social teaching is a branch of moral theology. The encyclical is now part of the ordinary magisterium of the Church, which means the faithful, and those who claim to be faithful, have to adhere to this teaching with religious assent. And that's very clearly outlined for us in Lumen Gentium in the beginning, our dogmatic constitution on the Church. Therefore, this is no longer fringe theology. Right. This is no longer fringe spirituality. This unites us all together, and it provides to us some clear direction.
Let's get back into the text a little bit, because we have to look at the chapter on the human roots of the ecological crisis, because he looks at the human person and says he basically says original sin is a reality, that this is something deep in us, and it's led us off course, and it's basically made us responsible for a lot of the ecological crisis. Now, he calls it this kind of technocratic paradigm. He talks about how we're very dependent on technologies, modern technologies, and how that shapes our perspective. But really at the heart of it is this way of thinking as a human being that I'm at the center of the universe, that everything out there is for my own use, for my own abuse.
What's the word he's using for that too? He loves these big words. Excessive anthropomorphism.
Yeah, right.
Now, I'm not going to call my mother and say, Mom, are you excessively anthropomorphic? But it's exactly what you're saying.
Right.
Now.
And the things that he points out, explicitly, he blasts individualism, consumerism, unlimited progress, competition, unregulated markets, among a number of other things. But these are things that he's always coming back to. What does that tell us? What does the Pope want us to take away from that analysis of the human person today and the way we see ourselves and the way we see our world?
Well, I think first off, what he's doing is actually calling, more than just calling to respect creation, he's saying that can't be done without community. You can't save creation, you can't fix things individually. So he's really calling people to come into community with each other, join hands across political, theological, religious differences, and come together and find what you have in common, because without that, we're not going to get anywhere.
It's the list that you just gave, as I listened to it, it just dawned on me. It's the compendium of many of his homilies over the past 2 years. He's touched upon those in different homilies, even up till this morning, about the poor, about sinfulness. It's very striking how he's bringing all of this together. And what is he doing? He's bringing us back to the human person. I think there's a line that to stop investing in people in order to gain greater short-term financial gain is bad business for society. And it's a very practical thing. Yeah, that's exactly right. He speaks about the throwaway culture. He keeps on using that, the descarto, he keeps on saying, you know. In other words, he's bringing all of these thoughts together and saying, these are not just pious ideas at a homily in Casa Santa Marta. This is at the heart of the problem.
And he's calling us to a change of heart.
Right.
That's what it's really about, I think, calling us to a real change of heart, to participate in God's healing of soul, of our own heart sickness, and community, and creation, with this clear recognition that we cannot do one without doing the other two, that these are all connected. And so this is a powerful call. He's naming directly that we have had false desires and made wrong choices, that a concentration of wealth and power without regard for the rest is eroding human solidarity. It's eroding community, as you said, Alicia. Not only that, we know deep in our hearts and souls it's making us sick. Personally, it's making us sick, spiritually as well as physically. And I think there's something in all of us, Christian and non, that rises up and says, yes, you're right. We know that this isn't satisfying. This consumer culture is not giving us the joy, the hope, and we live with deep fear and concern about future generations. And he's very explicit in this document about living justly, not only with those today, but in just relationship with future generations.
It's the future, that's right, he starts it off. What kind of world are we going to leave those who come after us? What are we doing with this home? You know?
Along with the analysis, the Pope does offer some ways forward, and after this short break, we're going to delve into that. Potential solutions from Pope Francis when we come back. Welcome back to our program. We're talking about Pope Francis's new encyclical, Laudato Si, on the care for our common home, an analysis of the ecological crisis that we're all experiencing. Marty, just before the break, you were talking about the social dimension of the ecological crisis, the individual and environmental dimension, and how those two things kind of fit together, how everything is interconnected. And in one chapter, I think it's chapter 4, the Pope actually develops this idea and calls it integral theology, integral ecology. And that's a new term. That's something that I don't think we've heard in the magisterium of the Catholic Church before. Alicia, what is integral ecology?
Oh, gosh, of course you asked me that question. I think the best description I have for it, I heard yesterday in one of the interviews I did. And I was told that, first of all, it's a realization that it's not enough, individual actions are not enough. That we need to engage in individual actions in order to cultivate a culture that will push for even greater, more effective change. And the other thing I was told that I believe makes up integral ecology is the realization that our climate, our planet, none of it is a problem in and of itself just for scientific reasons. It is a problem because it reflects the deeper attitudes inside of us about how we interact with people. It reflects the belief that whatever I do in my own home has no impact on anyone else. And integral ecology is composed of those two things. I think it also goes beyond those two things, but those are the two things that I can put my finger on.
Right. At one point, the Pope says, we're faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach for combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. Now, we hear there are reverberations, I think, in this integral ecology in the theology of Pope Benedict, Father Tom, especially what he called human ecology. We see it maybe deepened a little bit, but talk to us about that.
It's an invitation to coherent living. We have lived compartmentalized lives, so my private life in my house or my apartment at night really has nothing to do with my neighbor or with people in India or in Asia or other places or South America or in the Amazon. Human ecology is first of all recognizing that the crown of creation is the human person, the dignity of every single human person. And here you get into the whole question of what Pope Benedict addressed masterfully in Caritas in Veritate, and bringing together all of those who claim to be pro-justice and pro-earth and those who claim to be pro-life. And he was saying this is a question of justice together, that the questions of pro-life must be also concerned with the questions of preservation of the planet. And we can't be saying one or the other. And the questions of pro-life, for example, have to be the concern of life from the womb to the tomb, from the earliest moments of conception to natural death. And so what both Francis and Benedict and John Paul are inviting us to do is to take the wide-angle view of all of this and to bring it back to my life and to see how everything I do is a reflection of that bigger picture, that I can't be just concerned with my own self, my own concerns, my own ideologies or whatever. I've got to be concerned with the greater picture and of this beautiful world.
And it's a vision that goes well beyond humanity. He's really saying that integral ecology is about becoming in right relationship with all other creatures and all other aspects of life in the planet, and finding our place again, our rightful place, our appropriate place in relationship. The canticle of the creatures as a way to begin and end is saying, Sister Water, Mother Earth, every creature is one that we cannot exploit but need to listen to, as well as offer to care. So this, I think, goes well beyond humanity.
The next chapter that the Pope gets into, he offers some lines of approach and action. What are some things that we can do? And now this is really, really fascinating because he essentially proposes that different communities, different levels of society, whether it's an immediate community or family, or a local community, or a provincial community, or a national community, or the international community, has to develop scaffolding that will help us in this kind of conversion, in this new way of looking at things. And that's fascinating because a lot of people would say, is it the Pope's responsibility to be suggesting policy or to be suggesting, a body be created that could help us get to that? Lisa, can you comment on that? Is that the role of the Pope? How do you see that question?
Well, again, I think if you look at the fact that this is a document where he's really addressing the deeper issues with humanity, the deeper issues with how we relate to our planet, he's just offering, here's a way to live better. Here's a way to do that healing that Marty was talking about. What really strikes me, though, about his guidelines, that there's something there for everyone. Whether you're reading this and whether you are Catholic, whether you are Christian, whether you are not any religion at all, he's got something for everyone in there. And so many of his proposals come down to get into community.
Marty, are you surprised to hear such practical kind of advice?
Not from this Pope. I think he's resoundingly practical and speaks, it gets down to air conditioning and things like this in the Encyclical.
Architecture. I'd hate to be a city councilor in Toronto to hear what he has
transportation.
to say about the
And I believe, yes, green buildings, and it's an encouragement to those of us who are making our churches, synagogues, mosques, and other places green. But I think it's because he has laid out the urgency of this challenge, and we have to be practical fast. We have to get engaged now. There's not a lot of time. Without being alarmist, this is also a deeply hopeful document that there's enough time if we get engaged now. And if we're going to get engaged now, that means being practical in how we come together to make decisions locally, nationally, internationally, as he speaks to. And this is timed 6 months before a major international meeting about climate change.
Right.
And so I'm not surprised. We must be practical and get into these conversations.
Father Tom, he spends a lot of time talking about politics and politicians, the role of politicians, and we know when we look at the ecological crisis around us that they have a major role to play. Also, you know, public opinion and the populace has its role. But politics seems to be so tainted nowadays, and there are people, many politicians, who are dismissing the Pope because of his economic ideas, suggestions, now because of his ecological ideas, suggestions. How do you interpret that? What is the Pope saying about the role of politicians?
The most dangerous part of this encyclical is in chapter 6, the ecological education and spirituality. And I say it for this reason. What frightens politicians who want to make it a political issue only, they know it's much easier for people to understand this as a moral issue, and that's why some of them are trembling. That's why Senator Santorum would make such ridiculous statements about the Pope and his lack of understanding of chemistry when Jorge Bergoglio taught chemistry in Argentina.
Right.
Didn't have a degree in it, but he taught it. Like any good religious, you go and you teach what you're supposed to teach. That's why the governor of Florida would make such ridiculous statements as, I listen to my cardinal or my bishop or my priest to talk to me about moral things in my heart. Well, Mr. Bush, politicians, if they're Catholic and go to Mass, they also hear some very important words at the beginning of the liturgy of the Eucharist. Every one of us who preside at Eucharist, we say, "Blessed are you, Lord, God of all creation. From your goodness we have this bread and this wine, fruit of the earth, work of human hands." Which means, Governor, Catholic, Mr. So-and-so, Senator, did you listen to what the Eucharistic prayer says in your faith tradition and our faith traditions? The first sin in the beginning, as Archbishop Supich said yesterday beautifully at one of the press conferences in Chicago, the first sin was a sin of dual denial, of God as creator and ourselves as creatures. That is what the Pope is talking about here, the tendency to make ourselves the creator, forgetting that we are creatures and we have to be grateful creatures and to take into account the whole picture. That's why the most dangerous section of the encyclical is this one. When it comes right down to us, we have to do something to put this into practice and be practical with air conditioning, be practical with our architecture, be practical with recycling. It begins with us, with me, if I really want to love the earth and love the God who created this.
And you see, there's no, as you say, there's no stopping the power of the heart. There's no stopping the power of love. When I was moderator speaking about climate change, climate scientists would say to me, please keep speaking because you are speaking to heart. Right. We are speaking to minds and to reason and to logic, and it's not going to get us there. You and other faith leaders, we need desperately to speak to heart because this is what changes things. Pope Francis clearly recognizes it's the power of love that changes things. And there are certain positions that will be threatened by that.
The critique is, did he speak enough about human life in all of this? He spoke eloquently about human life. Without an earth to receive this human life and be our home, there is no human life. In other words, if we really believe in the future, if we really believe in ourselves, let us take care of the home that God created for us. And with that will come a deeper respect for the preciousness and the richness of every single individual, especially those who are poor and don't have a voice.
Yeah, it's certainly penetrating and certainly consistent, the message of Pope Francis always. The final chapter, and we're discussing it, I mean all the themes that we're discussing kind of run through all of these different chapters, but the final chapter on ecological education and spirituality, where the Pope essentially says, and I'm going to quote him here, that doctrine is not enough. That, Marty, exactly what you said, heart has to be lit on fire. Conversion has to take place. I'm just going to read you a quote. This is from paragraph 216. More than in ideas or concepts as such, I am interested in how such a spirituality can motivate us to a more passionate concern for the protection of our world. A commitment this lofty cannot be sustained by doctrine alone without a spirituality capable of inspiring us, without an interior impulse which encourages, motivates, nourishes, and gives meaning to our individual and communal activity. Marty, when you read the Pope's suggestion about building a new spirituality, what are you hearing in that?
Well, I hear it resonating with the words in my own tradition when we say we need, well, the church needs the Spirit to reorient it. We need to be reoriented so that we would live by grace rather than entitlement and be a blessing to the earth. I hear the echo of the words that are dear to my own church, and I hear a call to all of us, church and non-church, to have a change of heart, to be converted by the power of love for the sake of life, for the sake of all.
The encyclical is addressing ecology and the environment, but I think there's a hidden method here of Pope Francis, and it's for the conversion of human beings, to recognize the great dignity that's in each one of us, and to recognize the world that God so loved.
I predict that we're going to see a move back to getting into community. I just remember what happened after Pope Francis was elected and how so many people hearing his life story, hearing the story of his ministry, were personally moved to, if they were Catholic, to return to the sacraments or to revisit their lifestyle, looking, seeing that this man had refused all the trappings of that we've come to know of being attached to the papacy. It was a real example, and I think this encyclical is going to do the same. It's going to give people reason to pause. I think we're going to see people coming back into community with each other because this document has touched on that deep yearning that they do have. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a new yardstick politically, if we see people engaging with politics with a new set of eyes and actually looking at candidates and asking, if this person professes to be of a certain faith, how is that faith informing the decisions he or she is making for all of our community? I think it will become not enough to vote for someone because they profess your own faith tradition. It will now move on to, is this person living it? So I think we're going to see a groundswell. I think bit by bit we're going to see changes.
And this is a big year in Canada for
Yes.
public engagement. It's an invitation, again, to public engagement.
Yes.
During an election year.
Yes.
All right, we're going to have to leave the conversation at that, although, Marty, I want to give you the last word here because the Pope ends his encyclical with two prayers.
Yes.
A prayer, first, that can be shared with people of any religion, people who believe in God, and then a second prayer that's a Christian prayer, particularly a Christian prayer. When you read those two prayers and you know